in Europe to push the deployment of the CCS through the excellent research we do in Europe and in the European collaborative projects. The background, as we all know, is the high ambitions in Europe based on or under the umbrella of the so-called European Green Deal. Actually, one statement from let's say Mr. Green Deal, Frans Timmermans, he said last summer that much of the energy transition will focus on direct electrification. However, a lot of sectors like steel, cement, chemicals will need something else. It will need continued development of carbon capture and storage. And he also comments on the importance of clean hydrogen in Europe, which is a very important piece of the puzzle. And for us working in the field of CCUS, is highly relevant. I also would like to comment, and I think we all see this happening, and it's been a quick change in narrative, I would say, from CCS being on the table, and it's now moved from if we really need to a tool for jobs and climate protection. I think that this is a major step, and this has also changed the content, I would say, on CCUS research and industry development, because it's the major step that changes everything more or less. This is noisy, but it's a way to illustrate the European Green Deal. It's actually called the European Green Deal birthday tree. It's to illustrate that in order to meet the goals of climate neutrality by 2050, there are a lot of that's a big puzzle, and it contains some kind of major, let's see, these brown things. You will need to do something in the field of energy, climate, environment, transport, industry, and agriculture and food. And what you see in the blue and green here are processes and strategies that is going on in order to fulfill or to meet that goal. And I took some time to kind of think around this, and just put some red arrows on some major work that is needed and where CCS is relevant. I guess most of us find all these processes, it's not possible to have the complete overview, but it's a nice illustration showing that there is something, for example, called the hydrogen strategy. There is something called the European climate law. We have the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and so on and so forth. I will not go into those details, but I will say a few words on the one on the bottom left called the taxonomy. But before that, I must not forget the very important project, the Longship project, which is the Norwegian full-scale project on CCS. I would invite you to look into this video. I will share my presentation afterwards. So for those of you that have not seen this video showing the Pride and the very important project from the Norwegian side, where we will capture the CO2 from two different sites, hopefully, and transport it to the Norwegian shore or shelf. That is, I would have loved to say much more about that, but I just want to mention it. At the same time, I think I was also thinking it's important to mention the Porthos project in the Netherlands, and also tell you all that there is a new list, this 5th list of PCI projects that is out, and that shows that there are more projects both in France and Poland and in several different countries that is now stepping up, and I would be interested to see how that will develop. This is a slide to show you the FME Center and CCS. It's managed by SINTEF, and it contains many different aspects and parts of the, let's say, the value chain. The blue circles illustrates the tasks that we work on in this NCCS center, and I invite you to be more familiar with what we're doing, and please let us know if you're interested to know more. It's also possible to become partners in the project, and we are continuously developing the center. So, European funding synergies. This is a useful slide, I think, because it shows that research, demonstration, infrastructure, and member state funding all plays together. And when we want to either do research or to progress our technology or our company, this is something we need to understand. And on the left side, we see the Horizon Europe and the European partnerships funding research. In the middle, the Innovation Fund is very important, but that could also contain research. And to the right, we have examples like the Connecting Europe facility, which can pay for and support the rolling out and work related to infrastructure. And in the bottom, the issue of each member state's funding to support this should also play together. So a few slides on the Innovation Fund. This is paid for by the European, the ETS system. And there has just recently been a first call for projects. And the budget here is rather high, I would say. And it's supporting innovation in energy intensive industries, renewables, energy storage, and CCUS. And there has been a first round, as I mentioned, on projects. And as we see, there was 14 CCS applications. We can see this on this graph or this circle, and on the top there in green we see 14. And in total it was 311 applications, so quite many. And we see on the map also the distribution of applications per country. Unfortunately, I don't have the number of CCS applications per country in this image. But this could be something to discuss, and I'm also familiar with the CCS applicants, because they have now received the feedback. They have been invited to the second stage. And they will be submitting the second stage application in early autumn. It stopped here. This is not so nice. So let's see how I can. Yeah, I hope that worked. Yeah. So this is an illustration of the Horizon Europe program. A very large program with the first calls for proposals coming out anytime soon. And this red arrow shows the kind of the place, the most important place for CCUS. This is a program where we should be. There will be quite a lot of money on the table for us, and we are expecting the first major call on CCS is related to CO2 capture projects. And the rumors say that there is a call to come out with the deadline at the end of August, actually. This one is an illustration of the energy partnership that is expected to come. And partnerships in the European funding context is it's a way for countries and the Commission together putting money on the table to support research and innovation related to specific topics. Actually, there is about 40-50 partnerships that is expected in the coming years. So this one shows the clean energy transition partnership that we expect to see. It's been a lot of work over the last year, describing what could be the content and what is the role of CCS. These stars illustrates in what part of this clean energy transition partnership that CCUS is expected, and the largest star shows where the largest budget is expected to come. It's not to show you details, it's to illustrate that during the process of asking member states, are you interested in participating in this partnership? Different countries have been asked, and the colors illustrate the different countries' response to this. The interest for CCUS was quite high, and I will encourage you to have a dialogue with your ministries about this, because in the coming weeks and few months, the different countries will decide on how they will, if they would like to participate and in what areas. So if you want your country to participate within the field of CCUS, you should let them know because this is a dynamic process. From the Norwegian side, I just want to mention the climate program. In the climate program, we are this year working on our program plan, and input and feedback is wanted from the research community and the industry in this work. So I'm really looking forward to it, and there will be an outreach process also to ask for input on this. It's a natural stage after the launch of the Longship project. This illustrates a modus operandi, let's say, where in which we work in what we call the European set plan. It's called a strategic energy technology plan for many different technologies. So let's think that CCUS is one of a handful or 10-ish technologies that wants to drive a process towards increased deployment. In that process, you need to involve member states, commission, research, and industry. And this is an illustration of how this is being done. So there is actually regular meetings and discussions on how the research can contribute, how the needs from the industry side, what are the different member states that would like to contribute, and the core people in the Commission also meet together to have this on the table to discuss how to progress. Let's say more efficient. This is a way to illustrate this. So we call it a set plan on CCUS, and there is this process where, and this is led by the Norwegian Ministry and the Dutch Ministry and the Zero Emission Platform on CCS. And as tools in the toolbox, we can see some illustrations underneath here. I have a couple of minutes left. I would like to just quickly mention the EU taxonomy. This is a process where CCS shows to be very important. It's a way to organize Europe's implementation of the UN environmental and sustainability goals. But by saying that you should, in order to be mentioned as green, you would need to substantially contribute to, for your economic activity, to at least one of 6 environmental objectives. But at the same time, you would need to do no significant harm to any of the other 5 that has been listed, and to comply with minimum safeguards, for example, related to workforce ethics and so on. These are these 6 environmental objectives, and the 2 first ones have been kind of finalized when it comes to setting thresholds on how much CO2 can you be allowed to produce. For example, if you want to produce a ton of cement. My final slide. This is, it's not an updated one from the last month, this one, but it's to show that the different, when there was a scanning of different member states and their participation in CCS, European CCS research. We see that Norway and Czechia, we are positive to and active in the CCS research field, and the member state is part of the European CCS research initiatives. So by that, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. All participants are kindly invited to ask questions. I just want to remind that at the end of the conference, there is presentation devoted particularly to all financial sources available in Czech Republic. So there will be some of these information mentioned in more detail. But thank you very much for the introduction to the topic. And now, if you have questions, it's time to ask. Well, if no questions, it's okay. We can. So thank you very much once more, Mary, for your presentation. The next speakers will introduce a few industrial cases on CO2 capture and hydrogen. We will have 3 speakers, namely Christian Jordan, Gunhild Reichstadt from SINTEF, and Ketil Firing Hansen. So I kindly ask to download their or to share their first presentation. Yeah, it's visible.
Yes, I was muted. Sorry. Thank you very much, Gabriela. So my name is Kristin Jordahl from SINTEF Energy. I will present CO2 capture in industry a little bit general, but also some focus on CO2 capture from cement, since that's something I worked quite a lot with. And just to start with, what you see here on this first picture is prototype that was run a few years ago at Heidelberg Cement Plant in Germany, Hanover, for a small clinker cooler, which clinker is the what you make cement out of. That was cool, where the clinker was cooled with oxy-fuel technology. Just wanted to show you because I think it's a very nice picture. Okay, so just to start off, CO2 capture is feasible today. That is an important starting point here. Just it's mainly amine capture technology that is operating at the industrial scale. So amine is this liquid where you rinse CO2 out of the flue gases. And for example, we have Boundary Dam, which is a Canadian coal-fired power plant with amine capture that's been operating since 2014. Then we have maybe not directly relevant in a Czech context, but we have offshore natural gas sweeting in 2 points in Norway, where also the CO2 has been stored for Sleipner since 1996 and Snøhvit since 2008. So it's actually the full chain of capture and storage. But CO2 capture is also being improved. There's a lot of technology development on all kinds of maturities, from really immature technologies to technologies that would be ready for commercial implementation if you have if you had a big market. And there's absorption, which is amines and other liquids, adsorption, membranes, oxy-fuel combustion, where burning oxygen, you have chemical looping combustion. There's a lot of reference in the literature about this. And there are also some industry-specific technologies, such as something called high sauna for iron and steel. And technologies for cement was called LAYLAC and integrated calcium looping. So it's not a question about can we do this? Yes, we can, but there are all the other things that need to come in place also with funding and everything that Marie showed. And then if you talk about CO2 capture from industry, this is a slide that I borrowed from a colleague. He has marked a little bit on oxy-fuel combustion here with the purple and blue, but the main message I think from this is that different industries have different types of flue gases. The lower black line is atmospheric pressure with the CO2 partial pressure. And this is like a database of different actual industries that my colleague has plotted here. And we can see that also some flue gases are captured at a higher pressure. So we have different pressures, different CO2 concentrations, and of course also different impurities. So it's not to say that, oh, the neighbor plant did that. You have to check what is relevant for your industry and what technologies are available, what can be suitable for us. So I want to give you an example of how this has been done for some research that's been done for the cement industry, but hopefully there are also learnings from of the methodology or approach for other industrial sectors here. We operated from SINTEF EU-funded project on CO2 capture from cement in 2015 to 2018. We said we wanted to prepare the ground for large-scale implementation of CO2 capture in the European cement industry. We also have a website with videos and some presentations, a lot of material, if you're interested in looking more into this. We looked at several different capture technologies in this project. There's oxy-fuel, where you burn with oxygen, chilled ammonia, which is an absorption, membrane-assisted liquefaction. I won't go into detail on this, but the point is there are many different technologies that can be relevant for one industry. And they can be fundamentally different. They have different strengths, they have different challenges, and then what is suitable for me? That's the question. For instance, the energy provision is different. You can see that a couple of these use power. One uses both steam and power. Another one uses fuel and power. And then it's all, again, back to, okay, my plant, what do we have? Do we have access to steam in our plant or from a neighboring industry? Is it easier with just power supply? Is it easier with fuel? Because a fundamental thing is that CO2 capture will require energy. It will cost money. I mean, a research project can't change this, because that it requires energy would break. It breaks the natural laws if somebody comes and tell you something else. Then if you're going to install something, it's going to cost money. But what we did in this project is that we decreased uncertainty about the numbers. We understood more about the technologies also for the cement industry. We had a methodology in this particular project where we had a tight integration between the analytical work, where we looked at the performance, the retrofitability, and a lot of experimental work to understand more under CO2 operating conditions, since the CO2 concentration in cement kilns is higher than for power. You're about 20% instead of 12 to 15% that you would be for coal. And that was quite new when we did this in 2015 on such a broad scale. So we had a tight connection there. And then we also had a common framework to make sure that we did the analysis and the experimental work for the same kind of flue gas conditions. So we had some results on the techno-economic performance. What was the cost of the clinker, the raw material for cement? What was the cost of avoiding CO2? So we could have a comparison and understanding this. And we also did a retrofitability analysis. We said it would be like a traffic light chart with green, yellow, and red, but then we realized there was nothing that was red in terms of showstoppers, so more like orange, so a little bit more challenging. But that was a very useful exercise to really go through and systematically analyze different aspects of the retrofitability for CO2 capture in a cement kiln. Then we also did a CCU study, which can perhaps be of general interest. A lot of work has been done since this on CCU. This is an area that's really increasing in activity. What we looked at then was that, we have a potential carbon source in a fossil fuel-free future. That's what you can think when you're doing CCU. We looked at, I shouldn't say we, but TNO was leading this study, but the consortium looked at 16 different CO2-based products. And they were evaluated with respect to market, energy demand, maturity, and what's the price, how much can be paid for this project if you produce it. As you can see, there's nothing that's green all over. But also if you look at the CCU roads, that they have a limited opportunity for climate change mitigation, which is somehow the fundamental thing why we want to do CO2 capture that we mustn't forget about. And also if you look at the quantities of the products, it's perhaps 10% of CO2 from a cement plant, or for a few cement plants that could be used for CCU was the estimate then. And there can be niche applications with positive CCUS business cases, because a conclusion from this study was that CCU will always need the S. There would be either a market limitation on the raw material, or other parts that would pose a limitation on the amount of CO2 that can be utilized. But it's about finding the niches and the good opportunities. But the quantity of the CO2 that is emitted is so big that we can't solve everything. So then I'm going to speed up here a little bit. One project can generate another also. So this is an example from SEMCAP where it continued with just one of the technologies in oxyfuel combustion that is taking results further. When you start broadly, you can find a niche where you continue. And then also CO2 capture from cement is reaching industrial scale now in Norcem with a funding decision in 2020, and a full-scale CO2 capture will be operative from 2024 with amine technology. About 400,000 kilograms of CO2 per year will be kilotons of CO2 per year will be captured and stored offshore Norway. So a little bit, there are lots of initial questions to ask yourself when you're considering CO2 capture for industrial flue gases. So this is like a checklist that one can look at when you're starting to consider a CO2 capture project. What's the pressure and temperature where you can capture CO2? What's the CO2 concentration? Do you have impurities? Do you have waste heat available? That can really drive down the operating cost if that is available. Do you have space for installing something or retrofitting the CO2 capture? That can be problematic in some industries. And what are you going to do with the CO2? CCU will probably need S. Who can take care of the CO2 and get it away from your industrial installation? And then, of course, you must always remember the quality of your end product. And then finally, if you're initiating a CO2 capture project, don't reinvent the wheel. We have, for instance, in this conference, a lot of competence available that's been built up for more than 20 years in Norway, largely thanks to the climate program that Marie mentioned. There are also two important European fora that you could check: the CCUS Projects Network and the Zero Emissions Platform. The CCU Projects Network is more internal knowledge sharing between industrial projects that have plans for CO2 capture, use, transport, what it can be. And then the industry CCS voice towards the EU Commission, Zero Emissions Platform. There are also a lot of reports and information and knowledge that's available to extract from these two websites. And that was all I had to say about CO2 capture in industry, a little bit more on cement. So thank you very much for your attention. And are there any questions? Not sure if If there are any questions from the audience?
Хочу запнуть микрофон. Nevím. Yeah. It seems they are not. Yeah, I think we can pass. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
It was quite clear and comprehensive, so I guess this is the reason. Thanks. I guess I should pass the word to Gunhild Rijkstad with another case, continuation of the presentation. So 1 minute to share the presentation.
Let me see. Yes, the mute button. It's a good thing. Good morning, everybody. So my name is Gunhild Rijkstad, and I'm also a research scientist by Sintef Energy Research. And the focus of the presentation that I will give today is on industry clusters and how industry clusters and the hydrogen economy can mutually benefit from each other. And so I will draw experience from a couple of projects that I've been working in over the last couple of years. So then I hope that my presentation is showing. If there is any problems, I hope someone will let me know. So as I said, we have what we think is an emerging hydrogen economy due to the goal of reaching climate neutrality in 2050, which has really set hydrogen on the agenda again, because we see it goes into all the sectors. And if from an overall system perspective, it makes a lot of sense to bring hydrogen into the energy system in a quite different scale than what we have today. On the other hand, we also have quite a few industrial clusters in Europe. And it's seen in the climate neutrality goal. We want to keep the businesses going. We want to keep the industries within Europe. And so we need to decarbonize the industries. And in this crossing of interest, I would like to focus on 3 aspects where I think there is mutual benefit between these 2 hydrogen and industrial clusters. And that's in terms of shared infrastructure, both for CCS and for hydrogen, and also when it comes to the use of hydrogen for decarbonization. So for this presentation, I will draw on experiences from 2 projects mainly. So the first one being a project called Elegancy, which is also funded by ACT. ACT is an AirNet co-fund project. And Elegancy was a 3-year project that finished last year. We had partners from the 5 countries, the Netherlands, UK, Germany, Switzerland, and Norway. And each of these countries had national case studies. So they focused on the opportunities for having hydrogen from natural gas with connected CCS infrastructure. And they assessed the business opportunities for these kind of chains within each country. In addition, the Elegancy focused more on technology development for hydrogen production from natural gas with capture of the produced CO2 and permanent storage. The other project that I will draw experience from is the Hydrogen for Europe pre-study that was run in 2019, and we assessed available information that was available at that point on the potential for hydrogen from natural gas where the produced CO2 is captured and stored. And the pre-study later led to a hydrogen main study, which is about to be completed these days. So for those who will be further interested in this topic, I would encourage you to follow when the project is released in a couple of months. Let me see. Okay, that's the next slide. Thank you. And then, so let me start with benefits that I see for the industrial cluster of having hydrogen production in the nearby areas. And for the industry clusters, as I started in the introduction by saying that we need to decarbonize the clusters. And important strategies for decarbonization are capture of CO2 at the point emitters and then permanent storage. A second alternative could also be the direct use of hydrogen as fuel instead of fossils. So in the Hydrogen for Europe pre-study, we assessed the benefit of having hydrogen production from natural gas with CO2 capture. And then you also need infrastructure for transport and storage of CO2. And what we saw then was that if you have some kind of co-location between an industrial cluster and this kind of natural hydrogen production, you would be able to share infrastructure for transport and storage of CO2. So the CO2 that you need to capture from the industrial cluster itself would then be transported in an infrastructure where you could have economies of scale, and this would has the potential to lower the costs per kilogram of CO2 for transport and storage. So it would reduce the cost of decarbonizing the industrial cluster itself. The second benefit, as we see it, was that you would also have both hydrogen and capture of CO2 as options available for this industrial cluster. And we believe that this will lower the cost as well, because then you can choose between two options and take the most cost-efficient option for each part of the industrial cluster. And I have a couple of few examples that I would like to show you that indicates that this kind of hypothesis holds. So it's kind of its very first results, and I think there is much work that remains to really see the full potential for this. Let me see, it's not working as I was hoping for. There we go. So this first result was presented by Professor Nilay Shah from Imperial College London at the final webinar of the Elegancy project. And here he shows that for these are very first results for an example industry cluster, where they saw that when they had both hydrogen and post-combustion available, they were able to both have a deeper decarbonization and at a reduced cost. So this was some very first indications that the hypothesis actually holds. The second result that I would like to show you is also from work undertaken within the Elegancy project. So this is actually from the UK case study of Elegancy, and Nixon Sunny, who did his PhD within the project, has been kind to let me use and present to you some of his findings. So these are results for cost of avoiding CO2 emissions for a large-scale refining and petrochemical cluster that has scattered emission points. There are approximately 3.5 to 4 megatons of CO2 emitted per year at this cluster, and the majority of these CO2 emissions is a result of direct combustion of fuel. And so the emissions have around CO2, 10 mole% of CO2 in the streams. So if you see on the right-hand side, we have a cost of CO2 avoidance probability curve. And as you can see from the right here, the gray field shows costs for electrification. And as you can see, electrifying heat in industrial clusters can be very costly. And similar, as you look at the blue curves, this is applying only post-combustion CO2 capture at 90% rate and then offsetting the actual remaining emissions. And this is also quite costly. So when we move down towards the brown profile, where we have both hydrogen and post-combustion, this comes at a significantly reduced cost profiles. And they also, for this particular case study, they also did estimates for a case where they had enhanced oil recovery, which was seen to further reduce the costs. However, they also noted that there is significant uncertainties related to the geological reserves, market price for oil, and also the CO2 intensity of the oil that kind of emerges. So it brings a quite substantial uncertainty into the results for this last curve. So then if we turn our eyes towards the benefit for the hydrogen economy, I would like to bring into your attention a proposed policy to boost momentum in key value chains that was made by the IEA in their Future for Hydrogen report that they prepared in 2019, where they said that strategic development of industrial clusters for scaling up the use of clean hydrogen was key. So they saw that you could have a growing hydrogen demand in the industries, and this could both bring down the costs of the low carbon hydrogen pathways, and by bringing down the costs of hydrogen, you can also kickstart new sources of demand for hydrogen. And in their reports, they specifically pointed towards coastal industrial clusters that are co-located near ports. And they said that these kind of clusters are specifically attractive. And we have also seen the same in the Elegancy project, where, as I said, we had 5 case studies. And we saw that the national conditions are very important for establishing and assessing business case for hydrogen and CCS value chains. And we saw that there were quite significantly differences in terms of what was driving the business opportunity for the chains. But what we saw was that industry and industry use of hydrogen was a key to getting the hydrogen economy started. When you kind of start using hydrogen in the industry, you can bring the demand up to a high enough level to have economies of scale for the production that will bring the production costs for hydrogen down. Another opportunity as well, if you co-locate hydrogen production and industry clusters, is that with the large demands that you could have in an industry cluster, you would also have quite large volumes of hydrogen per kind of pipeline length or per infrastructure volume. So it will also lower the infrastructure costs per kilogram of hydrogen. So I would like to show you then one final example as well of how industry clusters and the use of hydrogen there could benefit the hydrogen economy. And this last example is collected from the Dutch case study of the Elegancy project that examined the potential for hydrogen in the Rotterdam area. And so one of the key findings of that work is shown here. So if we start on the left-hand side here in the upper figure, you can see the hydrogen demand for high temperature heating that was mapped for the Rotterdam area. And you see there are 3 different profiles corresponding to low, medium and high demand. And in the following work, we will work on the median demand for hydrogen. On the lower left-hand side, you can see another figure of hydrogen demands, and this is the demand for power generation. And you can see that this demand is split into 2, the base load demand and also the flex load demand. And so when these 2 demands were combined, and the result of that you can see on the right-hand side, then we see that the subsequent base load demand is dominant. And this meant for the assessment of the Rotterdam area that the need for hydrogen storage was reduced, and this took down the overall costs. As a side note, it should also be mentioned that for this particular case, off gases that were available and as well refinery fuel gases would cover almost 60% of the feedstock to be able to produce the estimated hydrogen demand for this specific case study. So that was what I had on my mind today. Thank you for listening, and I'm also most happy to take questions in the chat.
Yeah, that's a nice remark. Thank you, Gunhild, because you can also use the questioning through chat. You can choose two forms, raise your hand and ask the question, or leave it in chat. I just wait for those who might have questions personally. If not, I think we can thank you very much, Gunhild. I will give the floor to the third presenter of this co-presentation on CO2 capture and hydrogen. It's Ketil Fearing-Hansen. So I welcome.
Thank you, Gabriela. Nice to be here. I will start sharing my presentation. We are still on the topic of industrial cases, where the subtitle of my presentation is Technology Qualification of Carbon Capture Technologies, where I will focus on the work that myself have been involved in qualification of some projects. I'm working for DNV, and if you don't know the company, it's a global assurance and risk management company doing ship and offshore classification. We have a large energy advisory section. We are within software and digital solutions and also certification of management systems. We have offices in more than 100 countries, including in Czech Republic, where we are at least have activities within management system certification and supply chain and product assurance. So the two projects I will cover today is more specific the Norcem Brevik cement plant, but also the waste to energy plant that is planning CCS in Norway. It's already been mentioned the Norwegian CCS demonstration project called Longship, where capture of CO2 from one or two existing point resources in the eastern part of Norway, in Oslo area, are targeting at least to capture at least 400 kiloton each per year of CO2. And then the CO2 will be liquefied, transported to the western part of the country, and stored offshore on the continental shelf. The two here's images of the two capture sites. So to the left, the Norcem Brevik cement plant. Norcem is owned by Heidelberg Cement, and yeah, some official figure on cost of such a carbon capture plant for Norcem Brevik is estimated to 280 million euros. For the capture plant alone, excluding transport and storage. While for the Fortum Oslo Varme waste energy plant in Oslo, have a higher capex, but they are also capturing a higher percentage of the CO2 they are emitting today. To my knowledge, Norcem Brevik may become the world's first cement factory equipped with a CO2 capture plant. And we have seen that there is no other good alternatives for CO2 emissions at cement factories than CO2 capture. The capture plant will be the demand, the energy demand, steam and heat will entirely be based on surplus heat. And that's also what we heard. If you have waste heat available, it can be used to power the CO2 capture. And the CO2 emissions will then be reduced by 50% from 800,000 to 400,000 tons per year. And the reason why they're not capturing more is that that's the amount of heat they have available. If they should capture more, they would typically have to invest in a steam generator plant. When it comes to new technology, the Norwegian authorities have required that either proven technology is used, and if you have to use new technology, or if the application of new technology has a significant upside, it shall be qualified. DNV has issued a recommended practice on technology qualification, which can be applied or equivalent. And for those parts of the technology that are identified as new technology, the technology qualification programs shall be established and executed in alignment with the project master plan. In our RP, we define then technology qualification as the process of providing evidence that the technology will function within specific operational limits with an acceptable level of confidence. So it's a requirement from the authorities, of course, to have a third-party verification of the technology, that it works as intended, and to reduce the technical risk. Based on this definition, the following processes or subsystems were identified for qualification, and then is the capture technology itself, which are provided and conducted by Aker Carbon Capture. It is the CO2 compression with the integrated waste heat recovery, also a technology delivered by Aker Carbon Capture. And finally, a waste heat recovery from the cement plant using smoke tube boilers, and that has been conducted by Norsk Energi, which is the provider of the boilers. So the process that DNV is describing in our recommended practice is a stepwise systematic approach to ensure that you collect the evidence needed in order to have an acceptable residual risk regarding the performance of the technology. So it starts with a qualification basis, which is a description of the technology to be qualified and a description of what it's going to be qualified for. So the typical operating envelope and performance targets, functional requirements. And that has been established. You do a technology assessment, which is an assessment of what is known technology and what is new technology. With the idea that the known technology, there we will have recognized international code standards that we can use to verify that the technology is fit for purpose. But in the instances where we have new technology, we don't have those codes and standards, so we have to come up with the acceptance criteria through this process. The next step is a threat assessment, identifying how can the technology fail to deliver on its the required performance. And based on that, we establish a qualification plan. How can you collect evidence? How can you prove that it actually will work and deliver? and then you execute that plan. That will typically be testing, but it can also be analysis, gathering experience data, etc. And finally, you do a performance assessment to check whether the evidence collected through this process is sufficient to say that the remaining risk is acceptable and that you have reached the acceptance criteria you set in the qualification basis. In addition to this RPA 203, we have also a more specific recommended practice on qualification procedures for carbon dioxide capture technology. It's based on the same process, but it is giving some more guidance to this specific industry. So in 2019, we ran a project for technology qualification of the CO2 capture technology. And in 2 phases, starting in 2017 and finalizing in 2019, we ran a process for qualification of the CO2 compression with heat recovery technology. So that is one major part of how you can get sufficient heat to power the capture process is by recovering the heat generated in the compression process. Finally, we also had a 2-phase project with Norsk Energi, which is providing the boilers, and one of the main issues there which made this defined as new technology was the content of the flue gas and the high amount of particles in the flue gas. So I mentioned the first steps in the qualification process. We have a technology assessment, threat assessment, where we identify novel technology and the related challenges, uncertainties, and potential failure modes. That was mainly done in a 2-day workshop in Oslo, where we had participants from several stakeholders, technology provider, technology and end user, Gassnova, which is the governmental body regulating this, from TCM and from different DNE offices as well. So based on this workshop, we got a list of items that we had to find evidence that it was taken care of. Was specific for this project is that at least Aker claimed that all the qualification activities had already been performed in a pilot they had been running at the plant in Brevik. So our main job was to go through this documentation to find evidence that all the potential failure modes we had come up with in the workshop could be ruled out when we looked at the documentation. So we looked for evidence that the risks related to the identified threats were adequately addressed in the testing, and also that the performance targets stated in the qualification basis could be met. In practical terms, for each of these threats that we identified, this is just an example. I don't have permission to show the details from the report. But one threat could be that the solvent concentration became too low. We then found references in the documentation especially from the pilot testing. MTU is mobile test unit, where we discussed the evidence, if that was sufficient to rule out this risk of a low solvent concentration. We made then a conclusion and also an assessment of the residual risk of this still occurring. Based on these three different projects, we have issued a statement of qualified technology, stating that this technology is ready for use within the limitations given in the qualification basis. And all these projects were specific to the Norcem Brevik plant. So as mentioned also previously today, for other flue gases, it might be that you need to do an iteration of this work to see if the conditions are so different that the evidence that has been provided is not sufficient to rule out those failure modes and those claims. A few words about the second project, Fortum Oslo Varme Klemetsrud waste to energy plant. So we have been running the project there from 2018 to 19 with the qualification of Shell's CO2 capture technology on behalf of FOV. This technology has already been applied on a commercial scale, but not for waste to energy plants, so quite different flue gas. At this plant, the CO2 emissions will be reduced by approximately 90%, and plant energy demand will be provided from the current output from the waste to energy plant. So it will of course reduce the energy provided from this plant. The captured CO2 will then be transported by trucks to Oslo Harbour for storage and ship transport to the western part of Norway. So our involvement here was also in two phases. 2018 was mainly going through the existing documentation and experience from existing plant, where the involvement in 2019 was to follow up pilot testing at Klemetsrud. Because one of the conclusions based on our involvement and also other work was that it was required to have a pilot test with the real flue gas at site. That was successful pilot testing, and we also issued a statement of qualified technology around summer 2019. So to wrap up, full-scale carbon capture processes have been qualified for the intended use in the cement industry and for waste-to-energy plants. And the first full-scale CCS project in the cement industry has received full funding from the Norwegian government, as we saw in last December. An offshore storage facility in North Sea will be established with capacity of storing CO2 from those two capture projects, and also with capacity from several additional sources. Okay, that was what I intended to say today. So if you have any questions to this, please go ahead.
Yeah, there is one question in chat.
Yes. So the final usage of CO2 is to store it on the continental shelf in the underground reservoir to get rid of it. It's no say end use of this CO2. And yes, you will avoid then CO2 tax on this CO2. That's one of the main financial drivers behind this to avoid those taxes.
Thank you. I see there are two raised hands. Mary Bisween, you can ask.
Yeah, I just have a short comment to the statement that the Norwegian government has provided full funding of the whole project. The Fortum Klemetsrud plant has not received full funding, and it's important for us all to inform in all channels that they need more funding. They have applied for innovation fund, but it's not clear yet.
No. You say the government have approved the project but not fully funded it, so they need additional funding.
Okay, another question from Mr. Mahat.
Hey, good morning. Can you tell me who was the provider of the technology for the project for CO2 capture technology for the project Fortum Oslo Klemetsrud?
For the Fortum project, Shell has been the provider of the technology, and I think Technip FMC is the EPC contractor.
Technip FMC.
I think we will hear more about this later today as well, more in detail on the technology.
Okay.
Another question? You may take the opportunity to ask all three presenters. Christine, Gunhild, and Ketil. They are still connected. If not, yes. Thank you very much to all three of you for very comprehensive and in-depth presentations. Thanks a lot. And the next, or the last presenter before a short break is Simon Musenale, who will introduce a Czech-Norwegian collaboration on CO2 capture from coal, the first experience. Okay, we can see the presentation, so I give the floor.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Simon Musenale, and I'm research scientist at SINTEF Energy Research in Trondheim. And I was part of a project called Pilot CCS, which was financed by the EEA grant, and that took place a few years ago. So I've been invited to present you a bit of what the work we did here on this Czech-Norway collaboration around CO2 capture from coal. So the motivation for this project actually have been that lignite represent around 10% of the world coal consumption, and is a rather not very good quality coal product and highly CO2 intensive, but it is used in, for example, Germany and US and Russia and Eastern Europe for generating power because it has a low price. And what have been seen is that the consumption of this have been decreasing over the last decades, but this decrease have been halted around 2015, and that was seen as an issue to reduce CO2 emissions in Europe and in Czech Republic. So here we've been actually looking at the potential of implementing CCS on the Vresova IGCC power plant, which I guess many of you know. It's a power plant in Czech Republic, and I'll get a bit more detail on that. But the focus of the study have been to look at technology to capture the CO2 here, as the solvent is of course the most mature option and have been demonstrated, but other emerging technology could have a potential to reduce cost. So this is what we've been focusing in terms of looking at in total 3 CO2 capture technologies. And also we have looked afterward at how to transport and store the CO2 coming from that IGCC, which is of course a very important issue and can be challenging, especially when you look at one plant. So this project actually was led by the Czech Technical University in Prague, and the partners in that was Syntef Energy Research and JVRES, actually. And the goal was to understand the technical and economic feasibility of CCS from this pre-combustion coal power plant. So, and as I was saying, we've been looking at the Vresova IGCC plant, which is in a sense a rather unique plant because it is actually it was a town plant gas which was built in the 80s, if I recall properly, and then town gas stopped being used in Europe. And then what have been done is that they actually converted that facility into an IGCC plant. So it's actually the only lignite-based IGCC plant in Europe. And this produces around 280 megawatt of power, net power, and produce around a bit below 2 million tons of CO2 per year. So quite significant emissions. So if you don't know so much about the IGCC, I'm gonna provide a quick overview, but the idea is that you have coal here, which is first being prepared and then gasified into a syngas, which need to be cleaned. And there you have mainly some hydrogen, some CO, some methane, and product like that. And you need to have a cleaning step here because you have quite a bit of sulfur also. And then you recover heat to produce steam and generate more power. And then what can happen is that you can then go to a CO2 capture unit pre-combustion. So then your syngas here mainly contain hydrogen, CO2, some CO, and other component at a rather high pressure. I think usually around 30 bar, and with a high concentration also of CO2. And the idea is that then you get hydrogen after the CO2 capture, mainly hydrogen-rich fuel, and then you add nitrogen, and this is then used in a gas turbine system to produce power, and then you can also get recover steam to produce more power also afterward. So, of course, implementing CCS will result to modification of the plant. So you need to, for example, modify how you remove the H2S to really maximize that you get just the H2S and then recover the CO2 separately. But a key question, as we were saying here, is what is the best technology to use here, in a sense? And here we look at 3 technology. The first one was Rectisol. It's actually one of the most popular technology for sour gas removal in coal application, and actually it was the one used in the power plant to remove the H2S and a bit of CO2. And it's considered to be a suitable technology for when you have a higher CO2 concentration in there. I should say also that it's maybe not the best solvent in terms of toxicity, because it's methanol, and the conditions also get around minus 50 C also. So it presents also some challenges also, but it is rather in a sense simple process in terms that this is a multi-flash capture and then regeneration of the CO2 coming in the flue gas. So you get different CO2 rich stream by changing the pressure level after the absorption of the solvent, and then you can compress that to get the quite CO2 rich stream, and then you get the hydrogen rich syngas separately. The other technology that was looked at was a membrane, and specifically polymeric membrane for CO2 capture. And we look at 2 different types of membranes, CO2 selective and hydrogen selective. And the main thing here is that basically the principle of a membrane is that you have part of the gas on one side which goes through the membrane layer, and one of the components is usually favored. So if you have good membranes, basically you will end up with enriching to, for example, either a cascade to get, for example, the hydrogen separated from the rest of the stream here. So here, this is a hydrogen membrane, and this is what's happening. So part of the hydrogen is passing with, for example, some CO2 here, but you have a higher concentration of hydrogen and less CO2 than in the syngas. And here again, you have then end up with a high purity hydrogen here, and the CO2 rich stream is then going there. This is a process which is mainly driven by compression and pumping. So this is also an advantage here, that you have a syngas which is also having a high pressure, and you have a high concentration here, so which also is driving the separation. And the last process which was being looked at is the low temperature capture technology. So it's fairly simple in conceptually. So it's basically you're liquefying your CO2 by compressing and cooling the syngas. And this is how it kind of looks. So you start from the syngas and you compress the syngas to usually around 100 bar, if I recall, a bit higher than that. And the pressure that you select here drive the level of CO2 removal. And then basically you have a system to cool your syngas until you partially liquefied some. So you have here CO2 rich mixture, and then you purify it through a flash. And the interesting part is that here you get liquid CO2 at around -7 bar, around 7 bar and -50 degree. And then you can just pump it and pass back the heat to the rest of the process to get higher temperature CO2. So it's a process which combines what is usually called CO2 capture and the conditioning also. And then here you have your hydrogen-rich syngas, which is then passing through an expansion system to recover the heat spent into the compression, and then can go back to the power generation part. One thing that can be said about that is actually Sintef Energy have a low temperature pilot facility that actually can capture 10 tons of CO2 per day. It's been mainly used for post-combustion capture, but I think my colleague, if I recall, they are working on converting it to hydrogen. I'm not sure if it's already completed yet. But yeah. So some results on this technology comparison. So what we see is that you have cost of electricity and CO2 avoidance cost, and the CO2 capture is maybe what's talked to best into the comparing the technology. Is that the low temperature and the rectisol process are the most cost efficient. The polymeric membrane do not appear to be a good solution here because they end up into too much of a power loss, especially. And in a sense, what you see is that the electricity cost increased by a bit less than 50%. But the capture cost and conditioning overall is below 50 euro per ton, which is actually a not bad cost in early stage also. One other thing that we looked at, because what can be challenging in especially when starting a project at an early phase, is to capture everything. So we also look at what we call partial capture. So for example, if you say that instead of wanting to capture 85% or 90% of the CO2 emitted by the plant, you want to only capture 50 because you rather start with something which is a bit more modest. Like for example, look in the Norcem plant, as was just said earlier, where they capture 40%. And what we looked at is what impact that this had on the technology comparison. And what we see is that actually this is something that will benefit to the low temperature capture technology. There's a very little increase in cost of CO2 capture when you go to partial capture, but the cost of the rectisol process here was increasing, and the reason for that is that there's a significant part in capex, which then do not benefit in economies of scale here. So that was actually making the low temperature technology more attractive from the cost point of view. Yeah. And then, as I was saying, we also looked at CO2 transport and storage, and we especially look at transporting the CO2 from either a local to a local onshore a storage facility in Czech Republic, or for example, going to a potential European hub where the CO2 could then be further sent to the North Sea, and compare here two different technological options: pipeline, which you have in green, and train, which could also be another option that could potentially reduce investment compared to a pipeline. And to do that, we use actually a tool that has been developed at Center for Energy called CCUS, which is a tool for integrated techno-economic and environmental assessment of CCS value chain. Here, where we can combine different pieces actually of technology to, in a sense, evaluate overall performance and actually optimize different elements here. So from the IGCC plant, here we look at, for example, compression and conditioning and pipeline export for the two cases, and that imply different set of transport distances and reboosting along the way, depending on the cases, until the storage point or the hub. And same here with the chain where you have to liquefy the CO2, export it via train over different distances. Here, the distances are not the same because you will not be able to follow the same pathways, especially for a railway. You will not build new railway, you'll rely on what you already have. And here in that case, it was meaning that actually the distances was not very favorable to the train transport here. And then you have to recondition and then go to the storages. And for each of these cases, so we optimize actually the pipeline characteristics and train logistics. And also we looked at the impurities that you can have in the CO2 capture, the stream resulting from the CO2 capture, what impact it had on the transport. So the results are shown here, and basically the conclusion here was that actually the pipeline transport was was better in these cases. As I was saying, the distances are shorter, so it's not very surprising, but the train transport could limit investment. So that also could be an option, especially if you have uncertainties of if you're going to have a 25 years project, or if it might expand or change at a later point. So to sum up, so we look at CCS from the Bresova IGCC plant. What we say from the capture part is that the best technology are the low temperature capture and the Rectisol process. The low temperature capture is a bit cheaper but less mature than Rectisol. We look at different transport and storage option, and storing the CO2 locally in Czech Republic will be cheaper, and the transport via pipeline also seems to be cheaper. And when combining all this, the capture, the transport, and the storage, we end up to a CO2 avoidance cost of around 55 euro per ton for the whole chain, which is actually not bad, I would say. And more generally, in terms of the value of this project beyond the scientific perspective, I would say that this has been a valuable collaboration between Czech Republic and Norway, where there's been actually really good potential and good achievement enabled by the fact that we had people that were more CCS experts and also people that were more power plant experts in Czech Republic and knew really a lot about the Bresova facility. So that was actually very good from our colleague at Prague University. And it's actually been a valuable work to support also the Czech industry, and also a lot of exchange of knowledge between the two between the three institutions and the two countries. So if you want to know more detail, you can always ask a question. And of course, there's more. We have actually published a couple of papers which provide more detail on the result of the study. So you're free to either take a look or send me an email and I can send it to you. Okay, thank you. And I'd like to acknowledge the Norway grant for supporting this project. And don't hesitate if you have any questions.
Thank you very much for this practical insight into a real project, including the cost, which is the most interested part, especially when I remember from the June webinar, the economic part of all the projects was always the most requested. So thanks a lot for that. There was one question in chat that was answered during your presentation. So are there more questions? Okay, so if not...
Otherwise, it's time for coffee.
Yeah, it's time for coffee. Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you all. let's have a 5-minute break, and we will meet 10:35 again. Okay, so see you soon.
See you.
before start the second part, I will kindly ask Mr. Rahul Anantaharaman to share his presentation. Yeah, welcome. Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
If you may try the full screen, it will be better, but it's
Yes.
it's readable.
Of course.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Just let me know when I should start.
Yeah, I think let me just introduce you once more properly. So the next presentation prepared Rahul Arantahaman, and it's focused on industrial hubs and CO2 transport. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to present. I'm Rahul Anantaharaman from Center for Energy Research. And I'll be talking about hubs as a basis for European CCUS ecosystem. We heard a little bit about the shared infrastructure and the effect it has when we look at hydrogen scenarios. So this is looking primarily at post-combustion capture systems, primarily, but you could consider the same thing also for hydrogen. So when you look at the CCS chain, I'm not using the U now, but the utilization is going to add a small addition to this. But in a CCS chain, what we're talking about is having the flue gas. You probably need to clean it. Some preconditioning may be required. Then you go to a CO2 capture unit, and then you condition the CO2, transport it via either ship or pipelines or even trains, as we saw earlier, and then go to storage or possibly to a utilization endpoint. So this is the overall chain, and typically when we talk about hubs, what we're talking about is a case where we share infrastructure. So a little bit of background. CCS, when we started talking about it, primarily was to capture CO2 from really large power plants, like the one we saw earlier in the earlier presentation. But then over the last 8 to 10 years, there's been a gradual shift towards looking at industrial point sources rather than power plants. And more recently, the idea has been, let's focus more on industrial clusters, because as I'll show later, that's what we're talking about. You don't see that many standalone industrial point sources. Most of them are in clusters for a lot of reasons, because there's a lot of synergy in these industries, so they tend to form clusters in a sense. So when we talk about industrial clusters, what we're talking about shared resources or infrastructure. And these shared resources are important because of these economies of scale. Again, something we've seen before in today, and also other limitations that could be there. So when we talk about hubs, let me start from the capture perspective first, and then go on to the transport and storage part. So from a capture perspective, typically in industrial facilities, what you could possibly have are space limitations or limitations in utility. So for example, with absorption-based capture, you need heat for regeneration of the solvent. So maybe an industrial facility doesn't have available heat for capture, whereas another for regeneration, whereas another industry may have excess heat that could be used for regeneration. So there are these kind of constraints that could be important. So when we consider these constraints, you could think about alternative layouts and configurations. Before going into that, just touching briefly on the different capture technologies You've heard, again, with the long ship, with the absorption technologies being the most mature. And not only that, they exhibit economies of scale. So the larger you build them, the more cost efficient they are. So there's a scale up opportunity here, up to a certain extent, of course. In the case of membranes, they are considered compact technologies, but they don't tend to scale up. They tend to scale out. That is, you add multiple membrane units, so they tend to scale out as you increase the scale. Adsorption are somewhere in between. They exhibit economies of scale to a certain extent, but mostly scale out. So in that sense, absorption, when we talk about sharing of resources and these kind of things, absorption seems to be the most relevant technology, in a sense, to look at or to study. So when we're talking about alternative layouts, from an absorption perspective, you can have a flue gas point source, and then it goes to an absorber section, and then you regenerate your CO2 subsequently, and then compress it and get it to the conditions at the fence for transport and storage subsequently. There are different ways you can put this together, again, depending on space considerations or other limitations. So for instance, you could have an absorber unit right next to the plant, emission source, whereas the regeneration and compression far away. Again, from in an absorption plant, this is possible because the CO2 is then stored in a liquid which can be pumped long distances. So it is very much a possibility. Or you could have your absorption a little bit located further away from the emission source, and then your CO2 regeneration and compression a little bit further away. Or you could collect CO2 from different sources into a common absorber and then have a common regenerator also. Or a case which is not shown here is you could have different CO2 absorbers, then collect them together into a common regenerator and then release it. So all these different configurations are possible. And these configurations allow us to share resources at an industrial cluster level also, apart from just a single industry level, also at an industrial cluster level. So as I was talking, economics of scale are important here. So the cost of absorption process reduces with increasing point up to a certain level. So beyond a certain point where you need to add a new absorber, because say you have a size limitation of, you can go up to maximum 12 to 15 meters in diameter for the absorption column. So then you need to add a new column. So then you lose your economy of scale, but till that point, which is quite large, you do get an economy of scale effect. So by doing this, you could consider collecting different point sources into a large common capture plant. But we do have a problem in that these ducts that you need to transfer your low pressure CO2 exhaust gases, they can be very expensive. Particularly these large ducts could be very expensive over larger distances. So typically you will not build these kind of common collection plants for absorption units unless they are very close to each other, or you really have a space limitation. Otherwise, you would tend to build these individually. But what you could do is actually build a common regeneration plant because liquid can be pumped to large distances. You can have a common regeneration facility. And for instance, like I mentioned, you could capture your CO2, you could have the absorption unit in different plants and then have a regeneration in a facility a little bit far away, but in a plant that has excess heat so that you can regenerate the steam, regenerate it with steam that is available. and pump the regenerated solvent back to the other plants. So these kind of configurations are possible when you think about industrial clusters and shared resources or hubs, so kind of capture hubs, if you will. So this map, I'm just showing to show that the emission sources are sort of distributed quite a bit, even though there are a few clusters, quite a few clusters, particularly in the UK, in Germany, and also in the Czech Republic. There are a few clusters, but nevertheless, most likely storage inland is going to be an issue. I know the next presentation is a little bit on inland storage in the Czech Republic, but in most cases, for example, in Germany, this is not going to be a possibility. So as we'll talk about later, is also the idea of storing up in the North Sea. So the CO2 needs to be transported to a storage location, whether close by or far away. You need some kind of transportation to be able to take the CO2 into a storage site. And when you talk about that, storage costs are significantly impacted by the size. So this figure here shows that at these really low CO2 volumes that we're talking about from some industrial units, the cost of transport, it increases significantly. This is for inland pipes, but you see similar trends for offshore pipes and so on. So the idea of having individual pipelines for CO2 transport is really will impact the capture costs or the CCS chain costs significantly. So from that perspective, it is really important to consider trying to put these sources together and have a common transport and storage facility. And yeah, as I said, there's a similar case for storage also. So the greater the injection rate in storage, the lower the cost. Again, economies of scale. So it is very important or critical here to consider all these things together in large common infrastructure for transport and storage. So this is just to show you an effect. This is a study we did some years ago, actually 2017, for CO2 capture from the Breivik cement plant, considering different cases. But for this presentation, what is interesting is that the base case is with ship transport of CO2, which is what is planned now. But if it were a standalone pipeline, you see that the cost of CO2 avoided increases significantly. Whereas if we consider a shared pipeline and storage, then the cost again reduces quite a bit. So the shipping gives you more flexibility, but it is still more expensive than a shared pipeline. But the shared pipeline, as we'll discuss a little bit later, involves a lot more planning, a lot more people to get together to build such a network. So a good example of a shared infrastructure is the Northern Lights Initiative, where there is the water shared is the receiving and handling facility in Norway, the pipeline to the CO2 storage, and the CO2 storage facility. So using a system such as this, it is possible to look at sharing these transport and storage hub in a sense. So what are the drivers? So this is from the CCUS in Clean Energy Transitions by the IEA. So we improve the economics of CCUS by reducing the cost through economies of scale. You reduce duplication in infrastructure planning and development. You reduce the commercial risks and financial costs by separating out the capture, transport, and storage components. This could also be a trigger for investment, and this is we are seeing now. Once the Northern Lights infrastructure is being built and announced and in place, we see more and more people interested in having their CO2 captured from their plants being stored there. And again, this is more of a chicken and egg issue, right? So once you have the infrastructure in place, it opens up the possibility for capture and all other things. And also it allows continued operation of existing infrastructure and supply chains in industrial regions. So important considerations that we should consider when we look at CCUS hubs is coordination. Again, if you're going to do things together, they need to be coordinated and have a good timing in CCS ambition, in the sense that if multiple plants want to do CCS, they need to plan ahead in time. And there should be an attractive tariff for all parties, so that even the smallest emitter that needs transport and storage is charged fairly rather than exorbitant rate. And also we need to understand and accept the degree of risk. Lastly, when we talk about CCUS hubs, what we are talking about is when we start up and build these units, we are going to be oversizing them. So we are not going to size them for what one plant needs, but looking ahead in time, saying that there are going to be quite a few, these and this plant are going to come online sometime in the near future, and that's where all the policy things come into place. So from that perspective, government leadership and coordination is vitally important. And that's something we've seen in Norway with the Longship project and the Northern Lights aspect. And that is what I had to present. Thank you very much. Any questions or comments are very welcome.
Any questions? If not, I should add that this topic is shared between two presenters. The second one is Angelika Cyril from DNV. So if you don't have any questions, I will kindly ask her to present herself, to share the screen.
Okay. Okay. Hello, can you see that okay, Gabriella?
Yeah, it's
okay. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for inviting us to talk about requalification of pipelines for CO2 service in industrial hubs. I'm Angie Siddle and I work for DNV, and we're very interested in looking at CCS as an approach. As our Syntev presenters so eloquently put, there was a lot of advantages of having industrial hubs and hydrogen manufacturing centres, both from a cost reduction and the quite synergistic sort of approach, but actually producing hydrogen and sequestrating the CO2 from industrial emitters and hydrogen production. So thank you for that. As we discussed, there's lots of ways of actually transporting the hydrogen, and it was very interesting to hear about the Czech Republic actually looking at train transport. There are other methods as well that can be considered. At the moment, however, that the most economic solution in a lot of places where there's an existing network, gas network or a hydrocarbon network, is to repurpose the pipelines to CO2 transport. In the UK, we've got a very extensive natural gas system, and this can be used as part of a CO2 sort of hub network to sequestrate the CO2. We've worked in several projects in the area, both for offshore and onshore operators. DNV has a recommended practice, F104, design and operation of carbon dioxide pipelines, I would really recommend this as a good sort of reference document. It goes through a lot of the sort of unique properties of CO2, which will influence its use in a pipeline, including safety, material selection, construction, operation, and the bit I'm coming to, which is the requalification of existing pipelines. F104 goes through in a stepwise process to sort of go what you need to do to consider the feasibility of you reusing your existing hydrocarbon pipeline to CO2 transportation. A lot of the information that has been used to actually both in concept, design and construction of hydrocarbon pipelines will be used to basically look and see the suitability in the requalification review. So with the starting point, you've already got operational data, integrity, and this will all feed into the review. The process involves hydraulic analysis. What is the pipeline capacity? What is the likely phase behavior you want to see? For example, typically, if you go in the dense phase, CO2 would be much more cost effective to transport it over long distances. But if you have lower pressure, maybe you have to consider using gaseous CO2. We've talked a little bit about all the different carbon capture sort of techniques earlier on in the presentations. We have to consider the CO2 quality, which will impact on your integrity, and I'll come to that a little later. Another important factor is safety. Dispersion distances are different for CO2 compared to other hydrocarbons, so that has to be considered. Fracture control, that is part of, you have to understand the line pipe, the weld properties, what materials are used, are they suitable if you change the fluid to CO2. And then integrity assessment. The advantage of using an existing system, you've already have an idea of what your integrity is of that pipeline. So you've been operating it for maybe several decades, even longer. What is its current condition? And if you then start using CO2, what is the likely future condition will be? So by looking at all this analysis, you can then define what the transport basis is and combine them and advise on whether we think it's feasible to use that pipeline. Some of the key aspects which are important in this review. First of all, the CO2 impurities. CO2 impurities will depend on the source, as we know, and also the cleanup processes that are involved. Impurities that can exist in the CO2 will influence, first of all, the phase behavior, which can impact on how much water the phase can hold. For example, small amounts of impurities can have a very big impact on corrosion. Even when we look at but quite small amounts actually, and there's quite a lot of work ongoing to look at the impact. As you know, water plus CO2 can cause corrosion of steel. There's factors such as pressure, the carbon dioxide pressure. If you use conventional corrosion models, you could get very high predicted corrosion rates based on these models. The key to really controlling that corrosion and ultimately to the integrity of the pipeline is to really very strictly control the water content. If you haven't got water present, then you will basically mitigate corrosion. This comes to how you do that. Basically, dehydration reliability is the most important thing. It's not the technique necessarily, but you may want to make sure you've got a very reliable dehydration system. And the other important thing is you have to have very good water detection. So if water does detected, then to act quickly to reduce the time that the water is in the pipeline and take mitigating actions. So other aspects is safety. If you're changing the fluid from natural gas to CO2, there are consequences compared to using another fuel. It's important to understand dispersion distances. This is particularly important when you're in a low-lying region, such for example a valley. CO2 is heavier than air, and it takes a lot. Its distance to disperse will take longer. The most important thing is actually not to result in a failure. So if you can control the probability of failure, you can relieve some of the problems due with actually releasing CO2 into the atmosphere, as it is an asphyxiant, and you don't need much CO2 to cause a problem. It is important to know the current condition of your pipeline, existing pipeline. It's vital to know what the maximum operating pressure is and to operate within those boundaries. The maximum operating pressure will also determine what phase the carbon dioxide can be transported in. If you go to the dense phase, it will have provide cost savings. One of the interesting projects that's currently ongoing in the UK is the Zero Carbon Humber project. Humberside is one of the highest, well, it's the highest CO2 emissions locations. It's a very industrial area. It's got a lot of different clients there, British Steel, very intensive energy usage. And the UK government has basically helping support this project and to try and advance the UK's first net zero industrial cluster. It's actually quite synergistic, this project. It includes it's a large scale hydrogen platform, and it's also collecting the emissions from various plants that will then be captured in an aquifer in the North Sea. There's also Drax is a big power station, and that is actually involved, and it's using bioenergy and CCS to achieve negative emissions by using bioenergy. At Need Be, there's a first gas-powered station with CCS is planned. And the other thing is that the hydrogen produced from the hydrogen generation plant is being used to sort of supply industrial users. For example, the Triton gas power plants, by mixing in the hydrogen with the existing fuel, is hoping to reduce emissions and drive better energy usage and lower carbon emissions. So this is an ongoing project. There's a lot of partners involved. And obviously there's a lot of interest to see how this is going to pan out. So hopefully it will be a very good demonstration how a cluster can be effectively demonstrated to achieve lower carbon emissions. So just to conclude, it is possible to requalify hydrocarbon pipelines for CO2 service, and it can be a very important part of an industrial hub, and with all the cost savings and the shared infrastructure, it can produce a lot of advantages to the both the emitters and the people, the industrial hub users. High pressure natural gas pipelines are currently the most suitable for dense phase transport because you need quite high pressures to get to the dense phase, and this is quite economical. But you could use other hydrocarbon lines if they're lower pressure. If they're only usable for lower pressures, you have to use gas phase CO2. That concludes my talk. So I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
I also encourage the questions. if there are some. No questions. I don't see any in chat. No raised hand. So in this case, thank you once more to both to Mr. Rahul Anantaraman and also to Angelika Siddle for their presentations. We will share all the presentations after the conference. And now let me introduce the Czech expert, Mr. Vít Hladík from Czech Geological Survey, who will present you something more about CO2 storage conditions in Czechia. Before he will share his presentation, I should maybe inform you that the Czech Geological Survey prepared a website on CCS. So if you are interested, you can check it. There is also a link from our conference website. So it's recommended to have a look. And we can now see the presentation. Yeah. So the floor is yours, Mr. Hladík.
Okay, good morning. Thank you very much for the introduction, and also many thanks to bPartner for the invitation to this very interesting webinar. I think the technology works, that you can see the slides and hear me.
I'm sorry, unfortunately it disappeared. We did, but it disappeared. Sorry for interrupt you, but it's lost for a moment, but let's try.
Okay, so.
I have the copy for the case there is some problem, but it was working. Yeah, perfect. It's here again.
Okay, so someone has to start with the technology problems, of course. So up to now, everything worked very well. So someone must be the first, of course.
Usually it's me, so thank you.
Okay, so I will speak about CO2 storage, and I will also look at the conditions we have in Czechia from the geological point of view. But before that, I would like to start with a question: what can we do with the captured CO2? And there are, of course, several options for that. And the first one might be the utilization. It has become quite popular in the last years, all around Europe and around the world. But here there are several, I would say, hidden question marks related to these technologies. And the main one is the overall carbon balance that needs to be considered when considering CCU, and I will come back to that shortly. Then there is, of course, an option to store the CO2 in geological structures, pure CCS, let's say. Then we have some opportunities for combination of the two, which I would call the real CCUS. And there is, of course, one quite clear example of that, and this is CO2 enhanced oil recovery with subsequent storage, but maybe we can find more examples of this. So let us quickly look at the CCU and the climate change mitigation effect related. I borrowed a few pictures for that from a nice report issued last year by ZEP, the Zero Emission Technology and Innovation Platform. The report is titled "A Method to Calculate the Positive Effects of CCS and CCU." And you can see here on the left that if you use some fossil carbon for your activity, energy production or production of anything else, then you apply CO2 capture. Then and if you produce some products, then it's quite important what happens with the carbon in the end. So, for instance, if you produce some fuel, then this is burned and the CO2 ends up in the atmosphere. So here with such an approach, you definitely reduce your carbon footprint and the carbon footprint of the fuel, but you are not going to reduce it to zero. So this technology is not compliant with the net zero ambition we have in Europe in 2050. On the other hand, if your product is something where the CO2 is bound for a long time, I for instance use the CO2 for mineralization or maybe even the curing of cement, so then the CO2 is stored in this product for quite a long time, and you might be quite close to zero with your carbon footprint. And if we compare this with a pure CCS case, then you of course get the carbon, the fossil carbon from the underground. You apply the CCS and you store the CO2 in the geological structures more or less forever. Then you might be quite close to zero emission, even though this is not 100%, of course. And if you even use biomass as the source of the carbon, and then you apply the CCS combined with bioenergy and store the CO2 underground, then you might even end up with negative CO2 emissions. So this has been very simplified examples, and I encourage those of you who are interested to really read this ZEP report I mentioned. So let us now look at the CO2 storage from the geological point of view. So what options we have for CO2 storage. In principle, there are 4 types of structures where we can store the CO2. The first 2 are, let's say, quite well developed and already commercially used, while those 2 on the bottom are rather in, let's say, a research or small demonstration phase. So the largest storage capacity is in so-called deep saline aquifers, which are generally porous or fractured structures that contain salt water or brine. And the second one is depleted oil and gas fields. Then CO2 can be stored in unminable coal seams, where we have some different processes that are in place here, especially the adsorption of CO2 on the coal. And the fourth option is basalts and ultramafic rocks. This is a technology that is now developed a lot in Iceland, even with a small demonstration plant over there, and here the principle is generally based on a reaction of CO2 with mafic minerals. So before we go to the options we have in the Czech Republic, I think it might be useful to look a bit at some principles of CO2 storage, because I think that not everybody in the audience is fully familiar with the principle how this works. So first of all, we should be aware that the CO2 will not be stored as a gas as we are used here on the surface, but in a stage that we call supercritical stage, or sometimes you can also find the term dense phase, where the CO2 has quite a high density, let's say something like 600 kilos per cubic meter or more, and has a low viscosity. That means that it can move quite swiftly in the pores and fractures in the subsurface. And this supercritical stage is achieved if we are above 31.1 degrees Celsius with temperature, and above something like 74 bar concerning pressure. And in our conditions, in the Czech Republic, we can achieve these conditions for storage at a depth of about 800 meters. And here, as you can see from the picture on the right, the volume of CO2 really becomes much smaller than on the surface. And then if you are already in the supercritical stage, the volume doesn't change too much with depth. This is an example or an illustration showing the principle of storing CO2 in porous rocks. I think it's taken from the example of the Sleipner field offshore Norway that has been mentioned already. And you can see that the CO2 is stored by means of a well and injected in the porous rock. A typical rock that would work for that is sandstone, for instance, but you can also have fractured limestones, for instance. If we magnify a bit the structure of the rock, you can see that it's formed of rock grains and pores in between of the grains, and these pores are the space where the CO2 can be injected in. It's always a share of the whole rock volume that is marked here as fluid. And the bigger this share is, the better the reservoir is, of course, for storing CO2. And on the bottom right, you can see some microscope images of the Utsira sand, which is the sand at the Sleipner field. And you can see on the bottom right in black, these are the pores. And this is a space where the CO2 can be injected into. This is a main principle of keeping the CO2 underground, so to say. This big picture is a vertical slice through the subsurface. It's based on a seismic, a special geophysical method that can image the subsurface more or less. And this is a boundary I'm showing. I hope you see the cursor. Shows this is the top of the storage structure, and this blue area is the CO2 plume of the injected CO2, and you can see that it doesn't go up towards the surface, and the reason for that is that we have a cap rock, a rock that doesn't have pores or has really very tiny pores. As the CO2, this migrating upwards cannot go into, and the CO2 got trapped in the structure here. Why the CO2 is going upwards? This due to the density. I mentioned it might have a density of something like 600 kilos per cubic meter, which is less than the surrounding brine or saline water. So it's moving upwards, definitely in the reservoir. So this is a main trapping mechanism, but we have 3 more trapping mechanisms, and they cause that the storage, the safety of CO2 storage increases with time, thanks to them. The first one is the residual trapping, where the CO2 is irreversibly caught in micropores and can move upwards anymore. Then the second one is dissolution in the brine, and the third one is mineral trapping, when the CO2 react with minerals and creates chemical bonds. So what are we looking for? We're looking for a storage site. We have some criteria. Geological ones would be the capacity. We need the large enough pore volume to store the intended CO2. Then we need injectivity. That is based on the permeability of the reservoir that reflects the ability of the reservoir to receive the CO2 at the supply rate we want to have. Finally, we need the containment, so we need this impermeable cap rock, and this cap rock must have a good integrity. Then we have, of course, also economic criteria, like the distance from the source, existing infrastructure, the data availability, and other criteria like conflicts of interests, for instance, nature protection, and public acceptance or public support, which in our conditions onshore in continental Europe would be very important, I think. I think I will skip the CO2 EOR because I would run out of time if I go into that. But just to very briefly mention this opportunity to use the CO2, you can move some incremental oil that is remaining in the reservoir out of it using CO2, and that you see in the bottom right figure, the amount marked here in violet might be quite significant. So let's look at the Czech Republic and at our storage opportunities. Here we have the geological map of the Czech Republic, and in the blue lines there are the sedimentary basins that are marked. Everything you see in reddish, brownish colors is unsuitable. These are crystalline rocks or metamorphic rocks. So we need to focus on the sedimentary basins, and unfortunately the biggest ones of them are generally too shallow for CO2 storage, like this big one in green here. This is a Czech as a Bohemian Cretaceous basin. So in principle we have something like 4 basins where CO2 storage comes in question. One of them is this so-called Central Bohemian Permian Carboniferous basins. These are here hidden below the Bohemian Cretaceous to a big part. Then we have the Carpathian foredeep here, the Vienna basin, and the Upper Silesian basin. So the first results we have for the assessment of CO2 storage potential come from the European project titled EU Geocapacity. It's from 2006 to 2008 in general, and you can see a map, the product of this project. The red circles show the CO2 emission sources. In blue, you see the aquifers that would be potentially suitable for CO2 storage. You can see some of them here in Bohemia. This is the Permian Carboniferous that I mentioned before. You can see some structures like that here in the Carpathian part of our geology, and the small green ones are the hydrocarbon fields, also mostly in Moravia, and then we have identified some opportunities in the coal fields of the Upper Silesian basin. I must say that the level of assessment is not the same for the eastern part and the Bohemian part, because in the Bohemian part we are mostly on basin scale, generally due to lack of more detailed information, while in the eastern part, in Moravia, we have focused on defined structures already. These are some figures coming from this assessment. You can see that we have quite a large interval of probability of the storage capacity, ranging from something like 850 megatons up to almost 3 gigatons of CO2 potentially to be stored. And the uncertainty goes mostly with the aquifers, where you see we have a big range of uncertainty. And this can be illustrated by this storage pyramid. When if you go from the bottom to the top, you increase the certainty of the storage potential. And especially for the Bohemian part, for the Central Bohemian basin, we are mostly on this lowest level of the theoretical capacity. While for the Moravian part, we are more towards the effective capacity, so moving upwards with increasing certainty, but reducing the storage potential. The next step in the capacity assessment was a CO2 stop project funded from the EU Framework Program, finalized in 2014, and this is the most recent pan-European database that is now available. It's available for everybody by this web link. It's a EGDI portal. This is a European Geological Data Information Portal run by Eurogeo Surveys, the Association of European National Geological Surveys. And you can find there all the information, including links to the database, so all the data for all the countries that were involved, including the Czech Republic, are available on this portal. Then in 2015-2016, we made some update of the Carpathian part of the Czech Republic. As you can see on the map, we performed some reassessment of storage capacities within the REP CO2 project funded by Norway grants. And we ended up with theoretical storage capacity assessed at 670 million tons of CO2 for this part of the country. This is the Carpathian part. And finally, in the ENOS program, it was also funded by European money from the Horizon 2020 program. We looked at the CO2-driven enhanced on recovery in the Vienna Basin. This is this area that is shared by 3 countries, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Austria. And we developed a roadmap for CO2 EOR here and assessed the storage potential of clusters, of 3 clusters of oil and gas field in the Czech Republic, as you can see in yellow in the map. Here, let me mention that we were very much hoping that the CO2 EOR might be a kickstarter or driver for development of CCS in the Czech Republic, when combining let's say 2 or even 3 possibilities of revenues. First, the hydrocarbons produced and sold by EOR. And secondly, the revenues from EU ETS, let's say avoided emission allowances. And finally, also some incentives. Unfortunately, this will most probably not be the case because the CO2 EOR is not on the list of sustainable investment technologies, as mentioned by Marie Biswen in the beginning. So there will not be any incentives possible for CO2 EOR projects, even if combined with CCS. And secondly, the oil prices have been quite low recently, so the economy here, unfortunately, doesn't work. Maybe at the very end of my presentation, let us have a look at the regulatory framework. We have the basic legislation in place. You might know that we have the EU CCS directive that regulates CO2 storage in the whole EU and must have been transposed into the national laws of our member states. In our case, this was done by the Act number 85 from 2012. The Act had some limitations for CO2 storage. One of them, fortunately, has already expired. There was a ban of industrial CO2 storage that expired on the 1st of January 2020. So now the CO2 storage is generally allowed. The other limitation is the amount to be stored in one site per annum, which is limited to 1 million tons of CO2. And to add to the basic legislation, I have to say that the implementing regulations are still incomplete. So it looks like that everybody is waiting for the first application for the storage permit to start things moving, I would say. To conclude, let me state that the geology of the Czech Republic provides some, I would say, maybe limited CO2 storage capacity that would enable storing emissions from hard-to-abate sector and maybe a bit more, but not much more. The main capacity is in saline aquifers, followed by the hydrocarbon fields, but the storage potential of aquifers needs further research and also exploration to be verified. Unminable coal seams and basalts or ultramafic rocks represent an opportunity that, however, needs further research to be confirmed. And as I mentioned, the basic regulatory framework is in place, but implementing regulations are incomplete, which which leaves a lot of decision power on the regulatory authority, which is the mining authority of the Czech Republic. This is an advert of our information portal on the technologies, on CCS technologies that Mr. Kalvio already mentioned. So you are invited to look there if you are interested in. It's in Czech, so it's not, fortunately, for our Norwegian colleagues. And by that, and acknowledging the CO2 Spicer projects that paid for my time to prepare this presentation, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Hladík. There was one question in chat, but it was responded within the next slides. So I'm asking if there are more. It seems everybody is looking forward to have another break. We are just in time, so thank you very much for your presentation once more.
You're welcome.
Thanks. I encourage all of to stay connected, and we will see together for the final part of the conference at 11:45, where there are two, or let's say three, because one is a compare of two presentations before the finishing today's webinar. So see you in 15 minutes. I see here Matthew Campbell, and I will kindly ask him welcome at first, and I kindly ask to share the presentation. Maybe Eric will contribute as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So maybe you will start, Eric. Sorry if I understood.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So I will switch off my presentation, my slide, and you can share yours. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
You see our presentation.
Yeah.
So
that's it.
my name is Eric De Silva, a research manager at Syntef Industry, and I'll be doing this presentation together with Matthew Campbell from CCM. And so we'll be talking about CO2 capture technology and going, a bit into the specific, but I realize lots of technical information today, so try to focus on the sort of main points here. And so we'll give you an intro into solvent-based CO2 capture technology. And it's far from the only capture technology. As already been mentioned today, there's several technologies out there, but it is the most mature and it is commercially available today. And so based on our joint experience, we'll talk a bit through different issues that one has to be aware with this technology. And I realize for some of you, this is way too early to get into this level of details, but at some point, if one goes into a project and starts communicating with the vendor, there are issues. Okay, so there will be some information in this presentation, but so I want you to focus particularly on this slide, because this is the sort of basics of a solvent-based CO2 capture process. So you have your flue gas from your stack, and this can be from any type of stack, and it is routed into the CO2 capture unit. And you have first the cooling step, because you want the flue gas to enter at a certain temperature, typically in the range of 50 degrees Celsius or even a bit lower. And then the gas rises through a column, and it concurrently meets a liquid flowing downwards, and this liquid is typically consists of water together with some kind of amine chemical or mixture of amine chemicals. The CO2 in the gas phase reacts with the liquid and is to a large extent captured in the liquid phase. And the flue gas, with most of the CO2 separated out, then goes out of the top of the stack of the absorber. And the capture rates for this type of technologies can be anywhere from 90% and as high as 95 or 98%, even 99, if one wants to go there. So the flue gas leaves on the top of this absorber, while the solvent circulates to a second column where the liquid is heated. The heating causes the chemical reaction to reverse. So the CO2 is again here in the gas phase together with water vapor. And at the top of this column, you have CO2 in combination with water. The water is condensed out, and here you have then a stream consisting almost of pure CO2, which is then sent out for CO2 transport and ultimately CO2 storage or utilization. And the solvent then circulates back to the column, and so the solvent keeps circulating between these two columns, and typically the same solvent will stay in there for many months, but at some point you will need to do some maintenance on the solvent, because there's some degradation happening on the chemicals over time. So this is the basics. And there's a lot of finer points on the technology, and we'll touch upon some of them now. But so it's a robust technology. It works, and we already heard about cell cancel earlier today. It's been mentioned, and the Longship project in Norway will be built with technology from Aker Carbon Capture, a Norwegian company. But there's other companies out there too. Another major vendor is Mitsubishi Heavy Industries of Japan, and they're also represented in Europe. So there's maybe 5 or 6 major engineering companies that can offer this technology today. But there's still work ongoing to improve the technology and further reduce risks. So briefly about SINTEF. So we have our own small pilot unit, but it is designed for development of technology, testing of new solvents, that type of thing. And so SINTEF is very much R&D. And briefly about TCM and SINTEF. So TCM, I guess we'll return to this, it is a joint venture owned by the Norwegian state and 3 energy majors, Equinor, the Norwegian Well, Total, and Shell. While SINTEF is an independent contract research institute. And yes, at this point, if Matthew, if you're online, you can start talking here. And,
sure.
Yeah, and yeah. I can do the slide changes for you.
Thank you, Eric. For everyone, I'm Matthew Campbell. I'm Principal Technologist at Technology Center Mongstad. Happy to be here today. I'll just say a few words in detail about TCM and give you some sort of key points that are important for any CO2 capture project. So first of all, TCM is the world's largest CO2 capture testing facility. You could go to the next slide, Eric. And I'd like to speak a little bit about the offerings and experience that we have here that could be valuable for different projects that you may be considering, regardless if it's testing or actual CO2 project, commercial project development. So the first box is vendor proprietary test campaigns. This is where technology vendors, as Eric was mentioning, want to demonstrate their technology at the higher level, at the greater CO2 capture per day. And this is really the last step before commercialization. And these technologies come to TCM and they test for 3 months to 6 months to basically get the data they need to validate their technology and their models. Now, all of this vendor proprietary information is completely confidential, and this is cannot be shared with anyone, and we have the appropriate firewalls established within TCM. However, we also have something called open source or non-proprietary test campaigns, and we've spent over 14,000 hours since TCM has started gaining experience and knowledge and lessons to help the industry as a whole. Most of these tests were done with the aiming that's known as MEA. However, recently over the last year or so, we've done more testing with CZER1, which is an AMP piperazine, which is a new open source solvent that could be considered as a benchmark in the future. So all of these learnings from the non-proprietary test campaigns has been used to develop a service offering that feeds into our advisory service project for developers. So whenever projects have questions they want to ask technology vendors or questions that they need to know about successful CO2 capture projects, they could reach out to us and we could provide our experience from our open source testing campaigns. And the last real bucket that we have of experience is really on our active dialogue with different environmental authorities. Our test facility in Norway and in Europe was the first of a kind that looked at the emission permits and the modeling, and I'll touch upon this later, but for any project now that's moving forward, these requirements for emission monitoring and permitting will be of higher importance. So we have a division at TCM that could support with this. You could go to the next slide. Thank you. So just a little bit of our test facility at Technology Center Mongstad. So we have the capability of having the flue gas from two sources, from the refinery, and this is called our RFCC flue gas, and also from the natural gas combined cycle power plant, and this is like the CCGT. So we have the capability of sending either of these gases to our testing facility in the middle of the slide. And there's differences between these flue gases. The CCGT flue gas has around 3.5% CO2, whereas the RFCCC flue gas has around 13 to 15% CO2. And what this means is the capture tonnage per day will vary depending on which flue gas is used. For the CCGT, the maximum we could get is around 80 tons per day, whereas for the RFCC, we could capture around 200 tons per day. And this is for either the amine plant, that's where we've done most of the testing over the years, and also the chilled ammonia plant. Now, recently, what we've developed, if you look at the left side of the testing facility, we've set up a plot area, and that's to test second generation technologies such as membranes, adsorption, and other things that could be tested at the smaller scale, around 20 to 50 tons per day. And here, different technology vendors would bring in their skids and test with our utilities. And we did this because some facilities, some technologies would like to test at the large scale, but not as large as our amine plant. And it's also much more flexible there. We can move to the next slide. So I wanted to go over some of the key areas of importance for CO2 capture. And I want to go into some detail, but not into too much detail because we're at a pretty high level at this point. And then for whichever topic interests you, you could reach out to us and we could have further discussions. But let's give a little bit of information here. So for any CO2 capture project, the first step before you try to do a design, before you try to get a technology vendor to help do an estimate or a feed study, you need to have a good understanding of the flue gas that's expected to enter the CO2 absorber. So at Technology Center Mongstad, as I mentioned, we have these two gases, the CHP and the RFCC. And as you can see, there's quite a few differences in the CO2 concentration, the oxygen concentration, and others. And always what I like to highlight here, there's two components that require sort of special attention. And the first one is NO2. I see over here it's listed NOx, which could give you an indication. But the thing with NO2, NO2 will absorb in the amine 100%, and that will form degradation products. So we really need to have a measurement for each project around 1 ppm to determine how much NO2 would be absorbed by the amine. And this would be needed by a technology vendor or by TCM to help estimate the amount of amine consumption, degradation, and this can also lead to nitrosamines, which will require special attention. The other item is related to sulfur usually, or aerosols. Basically, if there's significant amount of subatomic particles, this could lead to enhanced amine emissions. And we'll talk about this later. At TCM, when we tested with the RFCC flue gas, there was significant amounts of aerosols. And we needed to install a special filter. It's called the Brownian and the Mister filter. And if we would not have done that, we would have breached our emission permit. You could go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we control emissions at Technology Center Mongstad. So basically, if you look at the bottom left of the screen, there's a small schematic. The flue gas enters a cooler, as Eric was talking at the beginning. Then it enters into the absorber system. However, if there are aerosols, such as there are for the RFCC case, it has to pass into a Brownian demister unit to remove these aerosols before it passes into the absorption tower. After this BDU filter, the flue gas is quite clean of aerosols and there's no major amine emission issues. And this flue gas would be, in a way, in terms of aerosols, similar to what we have for the CCGT flue gas. Then this cleaner flue gas enters into the absorption system. Then if you look on the right side of the screen, there still needs to have a washing system at the outlet of the absorber column. And that's either 2 water washes or 1 water wash and an acid wash. And at TCM, we have done tests over the years with 2 water washes or with an acid wash. And that really depends on the level of degradation products that are formed. But basically what I wanted to state is that we have the capability of using the BDU filter or 1 water wash, 2 water wash, and an acid wash. And this is very important to make sure that we stay within the limits of our emission permit for the amount of amine emissions that are leaving the top of the tower. Then you might ask, how do we know what are acceptable levels of emissions? How do we know what's acceptable here and what's not? And you could go to the next slide now, Eric. So as I was mentioning at the beginning, we have a division at Technology Center Mongstad that have worked with the experts in the industry, different universities and different groups to understand what type of atmospheric chemistry occurs when the emissions leave the absorption tower, and then what type of dispersion and dispersion models are used to predict the amount of amines and nitrosamines and other degradation products that are in the water, in the surrounding area, but also in the air. And this is the information that forms the basis of the emission permit. And that's where we tell the operation of the plant, make sure you're below X ppms of amine, X ppms of nitrosamine, and then it's the operations job to make sure we always stay within that level. And these type of thinkings are required for commercial scale projects. And our group from TCM can help if you want to have this information supported in feed study and as you move through the whole project. I think you could go to the next slide, Eric. Another area, we sort of touched upon it, is solvent degradation and reclaiming. So for amine solvents, there's several different types of degradation that can occur. There's oxidative degradation, thermal and catalytic, and as I mentioned, the impact of NO2, where this could form nitrosamines, which are potentially carcinogenic. Then one area of importance is to understand and quantify which of these degradation products are volatile and which of these are non-volatile. And TCM, with the support of SINTEF, have the capability of monitoring these non-volatile components with GCMS or LCMS. And then the way that we measure these volatile components, such as ammonia or acetaldehyde, is with PTR Tough MS or an FTIR system. And if you're setting up your instrumentation for a commercial scale feed study, we can help with these type of identification of instrumentation. Then what we always recommend is we should have an APU, that's called an amine purification unit, It's sometimes a thermal reclaimer, sometimes it's ion exchange, but either way, you need something to make sure that the solvent degradation products do not get too high. If they get too high, the rate of the degradation will increase even further. It will catalytically, autocatalytic degradations can occur. So we recommend to keep the total degradation products at maximum 3%, heat stable salts less than 1.5%, and also to look at the color of your solvent. So you could go to the next slide, just very quickly. The thermal reclaimer vessel is placed. You could see here, this is our typical flow sheet, absorber and strippers. And what we do is we take a slipstream of the lean amine and we send it into a reclaiming unit. And there we basically heat up the system where we boil off the clean amine to the top and return that to the system. And then at the bottom, that's where the degradation products leave and go into a hazardous waste treatment facility. Over the years, we found how to optimize this by adding some caustic, where that basically neutralizes the heat stable amine salts, and it basically liberates your amine. We also add some water to the reclaimer waste to make sure that it's not too viscous. You could go to the next slide. So there's many areas that are important or parameters that should be considered when optimizing a CO2 capture plant. For example, you might target a CO2 removal between 65% and 99%. And you might ask, how do we do this? How do we find what's optimal? And all of these parameters here would be considered when we're trying to optimize the CO2 removal and the amount of energy that's needed to capture the CO2. And it's really a case-to-case study. It depends on your inlet flue gas concentration. Are you at 3%? Are you at 15%? What's the amine solution you're using and concentration? What's the temperature? If you're at a colder temperature, typically the capture will be more efficient. But if you want to do a capture at 50 or 60 degrees C, it will be more challenging. Also, do you have any constraints on liquid to gas ratios, temperatures in your reboiling system, and what's your packing height? And we could speak about this in detail if you have any questions, but all of these parameters will affect the cost of trying to implement the CO2 capture project commercially. And I think there's one more slide, Eric. So basically, what's really important when you want to do a commercial project, you have to have the technology vendor has to have a model that can be used to demonstrate effectiveness of their technology. For SINTEF and TCM, we've developed a rigorous model for MEA and CSER 1. And the way that this was done is it's basically you have to build this model with basic data. I sort of listed some of the key data there, VLE, heat of reaction, heat capacity. Then you need to regress this basic data into a simulation platform. It could be Aspen or it could be other platforms. Then from data from the pilot facility of Tiller or the demonstration data from TCM or others, as long as the quality assurance and control on the data is accurate and you cover a wide operational window, you input this data into the model and you see how the fit is for CO2 removal, temperatures, and steam consumption. And if the model is reasonable for this large operational window, then you could assume that the model can be used for commercialization and feed studies. Of course, all models will have some uncertainties, and this should be considered for a large-scale design when moving forward. For example, how much extra packing height you need, how much extra steam you want to have just in case. Same for pumps and heat exchangers. So I think both SINTEF and TCM have a lot of experience in this regard. So I think for the last 5 minutes we have now, Eric and I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Well, the last, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just to say a few words in summary. So here we went into quite a lot of detail, and this would be something you would require when going to FEED study. But so it's what we're looking at is a reasonably mature technology. It is commercially available, but still there's a few projects out there, and there's still all these technical elements that at some point has to be considered. And a big step in any new project is to make your choice on the vendor, and there it's good to be informed before you make that choice and make sure you get the best technology for your specific needs.
Thank you, Eric.
Okay. Thank you both, Matthew and Eric, for your presentation. Yeah, now it's time for the questions again. I don't see any in chat. Your presentation was very technical, very in-depth.
Yes, sorry.
Thanks for that. No, but thanks for that. I should maybe also add that the aim of the project, because this activity is supported by EEA and Norway funds, but the next step should have been to enable those companies, Czech companies, where is a potential to cooperate with TCM to visit TCM. But with COVID restrictions, now it's not under the question. The visit was planned for June, which will certainly not be possible. We will see if there is any chance to prolong it. In this case, we would address you all. But yeah, you should take into account that maybe this opportunity will not be possible. So this is your last one to, possibly last one to ask something from the experts from TCM directly. Because the cooperation continues, but we will see how much detail it could be in the future. Well, no questions. Okay. Okay. Anyway,
Please just reach out by email if you have any questions to us that you come to your mind in the future. So, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you once more.
Yeah. Thank you.
And maybe those of you who have a meeting with TCM who asked for the individual meeting, of course, you have the chance afternoon as well. There are a few companies registered. So, okay. So we have the last presentation in front of us. I will share it with my colleague Michael Bonnot. We discussed together because we prepared it in English. But maybe we will, because the whole presentation is focused on financial funds available in Czech Republic from different sources, including EU sources and others, but open to subject in Czech Republic. So maybe it will be easier to present this presentation, because this one is definitely interested for Czech companies rather than Norwegian. So in this case, we will maybe switch into Czech. Hopefully, I will not disappoint my Norwegian colleagues. As I said, the presentation is in English. The written part is in English, so you can follow. But yeah, I think it's more reasonable to switch into Czech now at this moment. So if you agree, I will pass my words to Michael.
Good morning to everybody, or not morning, maybe it's good afternoon. I will use Czech and English language, because I would like to prepare or just to present information as well for our Norwegian colleagues. So I will try to do it bilingual. Gabriela, you will give me a presentation, or I should give presentation?
I can download it.
Okay,
but
no
maybe it's
problem.
easier if you. Okay, yeah.
Okay, I've got the presentation, no problem. I can do it. Okay. If you can see my presentation, so let me briefly introduce in English financial sources and perspectives. We are now in the historic change in the situation where we can really use financial sources from traditional European structure and investment funds. And in addition to that, we have available as well sources from Next Generation EU. So now it's the best time and that's the best opportunity to use these external sources of financing. So I would like to present this potential and these possibilities from two perspectives, from this time perspective, let's say, because we've got still available sources from, let's say, old time period from 2014 to 2020. And we've gotten as well financial sources from new planning period from 2021 to 2027. We've got available as well some additional sources from ETS system called Modernization Fund, which is available even longer to 2030. So we've got really a wide variety of funds available for your financial needs in the perspective of CCUS US.
Michael, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but could you please make it bigger, full screen?
Okay.
Because it's not readable.
It's better.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much as well. Okay, I will continue in my presentation. So the second perspective is the perspective of the maturity of your financial needs or the technology you would like to implement in your facility. If you are in the stage you need to receive money for research and development, I will present programs for R&D. Then I would like to present information for some pilot projects or implementation and for rather investment projects. Then there are available interesting sources for strategic and transformation projects. And at the end, I will give Floriela and she will present you some possibilities for cooperation for projects which are innovative in the European scale or which are managed from Brussels community programs. So I will start with these possibilities for research and development. First programs I would like to present are programs financed from Czech government. It means programs from Technological Agency Czech Republic. These two programs I think quite known by Czech companies and universities are programs TETA and Environment. Prostředí pro život. And a third source is a program from Operational Program Entrepreneurship and Investment for Competitiveness, with shortcut OPIC. One program is called Application or Aplikace. First program I mentioned for financing cooperation among companies and research and development partners for cooperation in energy sector. It's called TETA. This program is open till 2025. Every year is available call. This year call is just finishing. And from this program you can finance your non-investment costs of cooperation and your R&D needs mostly projects in public interest or new technologies and systems with high potential for implementation in practice, or you can be involved in some long-term technological perspective projects. So very interesting program. Similar program, more oriented in environment, is called Environment, or in Czech Prostředí pro život. It's a program as well financed from sources of Technological Agency of the Czech Republic.
Michael, I'm very sorry, but the slides are not moving. Sorry. I apologize.
Sorry for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so
now it's
we
working.
got environment. The call structure is the same like program Theta. It means that calls are available every year. The program is often opened till 2026, and the most eligible costs are non-investment. So this is the best way how to finance this first stage of your CCUS technology. Third program for financing R&D needs. It's a program from operational program entrepreneurship and investment for competitiveness, shortcut OPIC, called application is the name of the sub-program. The program is still available. Operational program OPIC is from the last ending planning period, but in May we still accept a call, so you can very quickly react and prepare some cooperation projects. These projects could be oriented on non-investment expenses for covering your expenses of cooperation, for example, with R&D partner. Let's go further for some pilot verification and implementation projects. You are at the stage that your technology or technology you would like to implement is mature enough and you just need to buy it, and you are looking for some subsidy. So there are available several programs. We've got as well program available from the ending planning period, this OPIC Innovations. We are waiting for a new tool called Recovery and Resilience Facility, which will be available in several months as well, maybe this year. We are now in the beginning of new planning period, so very similar programs to program OPIC and innovation are OPTAC. It means Operational Program Technology and Applications for Competitiveness. This program should finance implementation of new technologies, and in addition to that, but mostly for non-public sector, are programs from Operational Program Environment managed by Ministry of Environment. So these programs are mostly used for financing investment. So we skipped from non-investment projects from the sector mostly into the real implementation of the technologies. So as I mentioned, there are available programs from the ending planning period, like this program Innovations. We are waiting in this possibility and first calls in the program of Recovery and Resilience Facility, but we still are in the beginning, and the program wasn't approved by European Commission. So our government is preparing with partners in regions to finish this program. From the beginning of next year, we're expecting first calls from the new European structure and investment funds, especially program technology or innovation, are very interesting for implementation of the major technologies. You can receive project grants and expenses for investment costs from the 25 up to 80% of the eligible costs. Similar for non-governmental or just public sector operational program environment. You can finance if you aren't from private sector, so very similar to the program OPETAC. Third part of the presentation, or just the sources, are financial possibilities of the strategic and transformation projects. So rather more comprehensive and large-scale projects. We've got prepared interesting financial mechanisms from Just Transition Fund and from Modernization Fund. As I mentioned, this is a special fund financed from ETS system. The program is financed from other financial sources because it's financed from ETS. Back to Just Transition mechanism, there are not only grants, of course, you can use some other financial tools or cooperation with public sector, of course, or European Investment Bank. So there are extra money for regions which are facing need to transport coal mining regions. For example, this Ústecký region, Moravskoslezský region, and Karlovarský region. These three regions have this special program available for financing some transformation and strategic programs. First call for strategic projects is open these days, and you can apply for your major strategic transformation projects, or you can wait for some other calls which will be available in the next month and years. Modernization Fund and this sub-program ENERG ETS and ENERG, these two sub-programs from modernization funds will be available very quickly. In May we can expect first calls, so this is new tool, but is available very quickly. So if you would like to use this programs, so don't hesitate and prepare your projects, because the time schedule is very tight and we have to be prepared to apply for this support as well very quickly. This was very quick information from the perspective of the traditional funds. It means from the European level, European structure and investment funds available for next 7 years, and outside of that, there is some new program called Modernization Fund, and these all financial tools are available. So don't hesitate if you need some help and to use these programs, because they really are ready to finance your solutions in CCUS projects. And I will give floor to Gabriela. She will continue with the information of the with Innovation Fund and some other financial possibilities.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Well, as my colleague decided to have it in English, I will continue, obviously, because I have the international part of those programs. I just kindly ask you, Michael, to give me the management of the screen. Okay, just 1 minute.
Or I can give you a hand and I can skip the slides.
Please. Maybe it's easier. Yeah, you can see, so just let me find my slide. My part will be definitely shorter. Okay, yeah, we are here. So I would like to get back to the information that was introduced already at the very beginning in the first presentation by Mary Bijsween. Basically, I would like to focus on Innovation Fund and Horizon Europe. I will not go to the details because you have already heard the introduction. But I would maybe like to stress the practical side of those programs. So here you can see there is plenty of EU programs. We could find some more supporting the CCUS topic, but the closest are those two that we mentioned. I will start with Horizon Europe. This program itself is huge, one of the largest European program that exists. I don't want to do any introduction to the basics of the program. Instead of this, I would like to invite you to a webinar that will be organized on the 27th of April. Online again, it's free of charge. I will just give you a few information to know if this webinar might be interesting for you or not. And then you can get much more details, much more information on the program, and also on the new calls that are prepared and should be launched in April. We invited for this webinar the representatives of Technology Center, which is the national contact point for the program, and it will be presented. Each topic will be presented by the specialist for the sector. So you can have also very detailed questions if you prepare a project that might be fitting to the program. You are very much encouraged to link. As I said, the Horizon Europe is huge. Let me distinguish three pillars that it's composed of. I would like to focus on the second pillar, and I would like to attract your attention to, because the second pillar is dealing with global challenges and European industrial competitiveness. So the whole pillar is attractive or interesting for the industrial sector. And speaking about CCS or CCUS, you should focus on climate, energy, and mobility cluster, so-called cluster. So this one will be presented in details on this webinar. And if you prepare a project, as I said, you are invited. I will send you the link after the webinar. You can register. I should stress before speaking about other program. I should stress a few practical points as promised at the beginning. Firstly, when you think about Horizon Europe, you should always have a project which is highly innovative on a European level. This is first thing. It's not enough to be innovative for your company or for your sector in Czech Republic. You should have international partners, preferably from EU countries, because typical condition is to have consortium of at least 3 partners from three different EU states. You can have more; it's even recommended, but this is the minimum. To prepare such a project, of course, it depends in which stage you are at the moment, but you should count with several months of preparation, because it's really difficult. I don't want to discourage you. We have experience. It's possible to prepare a Horizon Europe, but you really have to devote lots of time and energy, so you should count with several months. They even recommend 1 year, but it's in case when you start when you start to deal with your partners, so in easy stage, in introductory stage. I don't think, if you have questions, please tell them in through chat or ask me after the presentation. I'm not going to present it in more details. I would rather skip into the topic of Innovation Fund, which was also promoted at the very beginning by Mary Bisween. It was said that it's one of the world's largest funding programs supporting innovative, and I should stress, breakthrough low carbon technologies. So this is precisely focused on the topic we are discussing today. It was launched by EU Commission, DG Climate, but and it's funded by EU Emission Trading System. I should maybe, yeah, sorry, I'm looking in the chat. I should stress two things here. When we speak about low carbon technologies and we speak about innovation, you should really take into account that, as you have seen, there is a huge competition. So we speak, in case of this fund, we speak about something completely new on European level, or something that is developed in new stage on EU level. The program is new. There were just first calls launched last year. The program distinguishes large projects, so-called large projects, which are above 7.5 million euro, and small projects, so-called small projects, typically between 2.5 and 7.5 million euro. I have a few information. Yeah, maybe it was already said, but I prefer to repeat the supported sectors. So there are basically 4 groups. It's innovative, low carbon technologies and processes in energy intensive industries, including products substituting carbon intensive ones. Carbon capture and utilization, construction and operation of carbon capture and storage, innovative renewable energy generation, and energy storage. The co-financing is 60% of relevant costs. Well, this is a particular issue, but let's leave it to the question afterwards, because the way how the relevant costs are determined is quite a comprehensive topic. I should also inform that you can also ask for technical assistance when you think about prepare a project to be financed through Innovation Fund. You can ask and get technical assistance because, as I said, the project preparation is rather complex. And you should, yeah, this picture is already known, but you should also take into account the schedule or planned schedule, the length of the whole process. Here you have the example of the large-scale projects, because these projects are divided into 2 stages. I mean the evaluation process, which has its advantages and disadvantages. The great advantage is that you don't have to prepare the whole project before the deadline. You will prepare the basis, the basic description you see here on the first in the first part of the slide. You see which part is evaluated. So it's the amount of greenhouse gas emissions and avoidance and degree of innovation. Then it's evaluated, and if the project meets expectations or requirements, it can go to second stage of the evaluation. To the second stage, only companies that succeed in the first stage are invited. Getting back to the time schedule, here you have the example from the first call that was open last year, as I said. It was open in July. The deadline to submit your project The first stage of the project was October. Then it was evaluated. Those who succeed received the invitation to the second stage. There was again the deadline to complete the project, which was the second part of, or which is the second part of 2021. Evaluation results are expected. Well, there is a procedure of several months, and the award of the grants is expected at the end of 2021. So you see, it took, or not, it's not completed yet. It's in the second part of the evaluation process, but you can see that it takes almost 1 year and a half. Again, I should stress that this is the example of the large projects above 7.5 million euro. The small scale projects are only of one stage, so the procedure is significantly shorter, but still you should count with, let's say, counting quickly, 8 months at least. So it was just a practical overview of Innovation Fund. If you hesitate or if you think about to prepare a project, in case you have more questions, you are invited to send them. Well, today during the conference or afterwards, we will be pleased to answer them, and of course, we also will be pleased to assist you with your preparation, but this, of course, needs much more consultation. So it's not part of this this presentation. I would also like to mention other sources that are available. For example, you can see here a European City Facility. At the very beginning, I should stress that this program is not open to the companies, nor the second one, Urban Innovative Actions. These are programs open to cities, but they both tackle energy sector. The European City Facility is precisely focused on energy and relevant sectors. Urban Innovative Action is much more wide and will be prolonged also in the next program period. So it means after 2021, and it tackles all the city fields of the development, including energy. But for example, because I know that among the companies who registered for today's conference, there are companies focused, for example, on central heating. So there might be a cooperation possible in some projects also related to CO2 reduction and CCUS. The next funds are mentioned also because you can distinguish support to environmental protection, including CCUS. At least the last two, well, they are basically not focused on companies, but as it was said, you might find partners, and in cooperation with them, you may develop the project on CCUS topic. But this is basically not what you are interested if you have a project to be submitted investment project. So I think I went quickly through all the supports. We are just in time. We have a few minutes for questions, of course, more if you need. So please, now it's time to ask me or Michael about particular program, if you are interested. Yeah, I see here one question in chat. You asked if we will provide the record from today's conference. Yes, of course, we will provide the presentations and the record. It will be available during the next week on our website, and we will inform you. We will inform you by email that it was published. because it will take, we will have to shorten it up and describe the individual parts. It will be pretty long. So yeah, it will be provided. Another question, is there an information available on Czech projects submitted to the Innovation Fund first call? I remember there was some very limited information in Mary Bisween presentation. She said that not particularly on Czech projects, but we can try to look for them. I will address the contact point and ask for them. So I will keep this question to be responded after the conference. I don't have such a list, but I suppose it should be available. But anyway, the deadline of the small projects was on March, so it's possible that from this call it won't be public yet. But I will anyway. I have my note, and I will ask for more details, the contact point. So it will be sent by email. Okay. Another question? Well, if not, I would like to thank you for your attention. I would like to ask to the Norwegian partners from TCM, SINTEF or DNV if they have something to complete, to add, to tell you something more. Okay, no reactions, so I suppose it's not. So once more, thank you all for your participation today. I hope that the information provided was useful. You were from different sectors, so some of the presentation maybe was not precisely what you were looking for, but let's hope the majority was something that you were really looking for. Yeah, I see here Matthew Campbell. Maybe you want to say, Matthew Campbell, something more?
Well,
yeah, okay.
We just have one slide to show about our joint global advisory services. Would this be the right point to show that, Gabriela?
Yeah, please go on.
Okay, let me show it. 1 second. So I just wanted to state very briefly that as everyone knows now, TCM, DNV, and SINTEF have a joint global advisory service, and our overall purpose is to support industries in Europe towards net zero or carbon neutrality by an increasing project value. We really have some complementary competences for testing with SINTEF and TCM, and more qualification processes and experience with DNV. And we also can be an independent third party that could help assess different technology vendors. So keep that in mind, and this could be very valuable for risk reduction for feed studies and commercial projects. And we're really looking forward to working with some of you. This joint global advisory service has worked in the past, and we feel a lot of value could come from this. And we thank everyone for their time today. And if there's any questions, please reach out to us independently, or we could have appropriate joint meetings. So that's it for me, Gabriela. Thank you.
Thank you too, Matthew. Okay, those of you who have asked for the opportunity of individual meetings in the afternoon, please don't forget to link. You have the invitations in your Outlook. And for all of you, I wish to have a nice week despite the joking weather. stay healthy, and hopefully we get an opportunity to meet in future. Thank you for participating today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Bye.
Thank you very much.